Welcome, everybody, to our 21st study in the book of Acts. Hope you're enjoying it. As you can see, I have no hats. All of my hats, you can probably see a little bit in the corner there. They're the only ones left that I've kept. I haven't thrown them away. I've actually, they're in storage, ready to go to the new house. And I've worn all of those hats, so I'm going to be hatless for the next few weeks until I take a couple of weeks off just moving to the house. So as we get into our study on the 21st chapter of Acts, I'm going to take a stab at a question that's sort of been plaguing on my mind for a little while, and in particular as we get to this chapter, was how did Paul justify his insistence on continuing on towards Jerusalem that we find in Acts 20 and 21? Now, he had several warnings, warnings by the Holy Spirit of what he was going to face when he got there, and included in that, there was a very graphic Old Testament style warning by Agabus in chapter 21, as you probably read the chapter now. Now, at the time, Paul had been all over the known world on what are often referred to as his missionary journeys. And now the time's come for him to return to Jerusalem. And he seems really passionate about going home. We read that in Acts chapter 20, verse 16, and it says, Paul had decided to sail past Ephesus to avoid spending time in the province of Asia, for he was in a hurry to reach Jerusalem, if possible, by the day of Pentecost. When we first hear about there's a desire here to be in Jerusalem for Passover. He's in the city of Miletus, which 2,000 years ago was considered a Greek city, but it's actually located in what we now call Turkey. A little over 18,000 kilometres from Jerusalem, if you were to travel there by land, but Paul had chosen to travel by water. And obviously, a lot of people may remember at school the quickest way to get there is in a straight line, so he decided to go by boat. So if you have a map, you can have a look at it. And this is where Paul's journey home begins. It begins in Miletus. And we're told that they boarded a ship and they sailed to Syria. It was there that they stayed in the city of Tyre for 7 days with other believers. And it's here that we read the first warning that Paul receives about his trip to Jerusalem. So Acts 21 verse 4. We sought out the disciples there and stayed with them for 7 days. Through the Spirit, they urged Paul not to go on to Jerusalem. Now, however, the warning doesn't seem to make much of an impact on Paul, because in the very next verse we read, when it was time to leave, we left and continued on our way. It was as Paul continues his journey to Jerusalem that he ends up in the community of Caesarea, and there he meets a prophet by the name of Agabus. And it's here that this story sort of takes a bizarre turn. So let's pick up things in Acts 21, 10 to 12. After we had been there a number of days, a prophet named Agabus came down from Judea. Coming over to us, he took Paul's belt, tied his own hands and feet with it, and he said, the Holy Spirit says, in this way, the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem will bind the owner of this belt and will hand him over to the Gentiles. When we heard this, we and the people there pleaded with Paul not to go up to Jerusalem. So here is, I think, where the heart of the question really lies. How did Paul continue, or how did Paul justify in continuing on towards Jerusalem that we find in Acts chapter 20 and 21? As we look at the story, as it spans across Acts 20, 21, we see three characters mentioned in the question. And hopefully as we look at these three personalities, the answer will become clearer. Let's begin first. There was a Holy Spirit. To be clear, this is the Holy Spirit, or there was a Spirit. This is a Holy Spirit, third person of the Trinity that I'm speaking of here. And the story begins with a prompting of the Holy Spirit. And so this chapter in Paul's life begins I guess with this note in Acts chapter 19, verse 21. And it says, after all this happened, Paul decided to go to Jerusalem, passing through Macedonia and Achaia. After I have been there, he said, I must visit Rome also. Here we see Jerusalem as part of Paul's overall plan in his ministry. He's to go to Jerusalem, and ultimately he wants to go to Rome. It's always good to have a plan. Remember the old adage, if you fail to plan, then you plan to fail. And it's even better to have God as part of that plan. And I guess that is a real good saying, just always have a plan. Jesus' brother James tells us in his letter, I want to read this. James chapter 4, verse 13 to 16, even if you do have a plan. Now listen, you who say today or tomorrow, we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Why? You do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You're a mist. Been looking at the word mist and vapour, or in the Hebrew the habal, and it's mentioned in Ecclesiastes, that appears a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say to yourself, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and does not do it, it is a sin for them. So it would appear that Paul had taken that into account, and his plans weren't his own, but they were the plans that the Holy Spirit had directed for Paul's life. And it shows up really well in Acts chapter 20, 22, 23, which I'll read. And now, compelled by the Spirit, I am going to Jerusalem, not knowing what will happen to me there. I only know that in every city the Holy Spirit warns me that prison and hardships are facing me. That's all well and good. But until we keep reading the story and discover that these two warnings that Paul's given, first by the believers in Tyre, then by Agabus. So on the one hand, we have the Holy Spirit pushing Paul towards Jerusalem, and then the same Holy Spirit warning Paul about going to Jerusalem. So when I read passages like that, I think, what's with that? But I don't see any contradiction in what was happening with the Holy Spirit and with Paul, because I feel that there are times that God will lead us into difficult situations, but he doesn't want to deceive us about it. Jesus warned those who chose to follow him in John 15, 18, 19. And I've read this many times, and it says, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you by its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. And this is why the world hates you. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't follow him. So the first person was the Holy Spirit. Then there was Agabus. The first time that we see Agabus, we see him in Acts chapter 11, verse 27 and 28. And during that time, some prophets had travelled from Jerusalem to Antioch. One of them, named Agabus, he stood up at one of the meetings and he predicted by the Spirit that a great famine was coming across the entire Roman world. And this was fulfilled during the reign of Claudius. And now he does this entire an interpretive dance routine with Paul's belt, if you can picture yourself him doing it, warning him about returning to Jerusalem. So what we know here, we know that Agabus was a prophet. Now to be clear, I want to be real clear about this. A prophet is not a fortune teller. They are people that God's given the gift of discernment to. And they speak that. In the Old Testament, they're often turn and burn type of people. And they weren't always very popular because of that. The prophets often exercised the gift of prophecy and discernment. And they would say things, if you would continue to do this, this is a result of it. So, as you would guess, they weren't popular. And the prophet's responsibility is to tell what they know. It's not their responsibility to act on that information or to even insist that someone else act on it. That, as always, is a hearer's obligation. So Agabus had been no dog in the fight, so to speak, or had no dog in the fight. But he felt compelled to tell Paul what lay ahead of him in Jerusalem. What Paul did with what Agabus told him wasn't Agabus's responsibility, which brings us to the main player in the game. And I hope you know who the main player in this chapter is. What's that? Yes, you're right, it's Paul. If you've been studying and you're familiar with the book of Acts, and hopefully you are now, then you know that Paul's name had originally been Saul. His mission had been to destroy the early church. But through a fantastic, a dramatic conversion experience in Acts chapter 9, Saul became Paul, went from being the church's greatest enemy to being the church's greatest hero, the greatest champion. And for 25 years, Paul travelled the known world, establishing new churches. He's now probably in his 50s, and this is what we read in Acts chapter 19, verse 21. After all this had happened, Paul decided to go to Jerusalem, passing through Macedonia and Achaia. After I have been there, he said, I must visit Rome. 2,000 years ago, Rome was the epicenter of the known world. And it was Paul's final destination, but only after he returned to Jerusalem. So if you've got another map that will show you the Mediterranean Sea, Paul is in Ephesus when he made the decision to go to Rome via Jerusalem. From Ephesus, he goes to Troas, and from there he heads to Jerusalem and to his final destination, which was Rome. Paul, I want to tell you, Paul isn't going into the trip wearing rose-coloured glasses. If you read Acts 22-23 again, where it says, and now compelled by the Spirit, I am going to Jerusalem, not knowing what will happen to me. I only know that in every city, the Holy Spirit warns me, prison, hardships are facing me. Phil Bentz, who's a Bible commentator, I want to read this because this is what he said. Whatever unknown lays in his future, Paul now recognised that a change was coming. Early in his ministry, he took persecution as the signal to move on to a new side of church work. Now he chose to follow Jesus right into the face of suffering. So what's up with this? Did Paul have a death wish? I don't think so. But neither do I think that Paul feared death. He understood that as long as there was work to be done, he needed to do it regardless of any consequences, regardless of any persecution, anything that was happening. Great passage in Philippians chapter 1 verse 20. He says, I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. That's a great passage, and he goes on to further write in Philippians 1 from 21 to 25. For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labour for me. Yet what shall I choose? I do not know. I am torn between the two. What a question, and Pastor Chris spoke about Paul's struggles. I desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is better by far, but it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain, and I will continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith. You might be more familiar with the what it says in Philippians chapter 1:21 in the King James version, where it says, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." There's a story told during the Spanish War, and a surrounded garrison they were encouraged to surrender, and one soldier responded, "I would rather die on my feet than live on my knees." In Paul's case, he had a mission. He was determined to fulfill it regardless of the cost. Paul would rather die being obedient than being disobedient to God. And maybe he shared the same or the philosophy John Wesley quoted, and he said, until my work on earth is done, I am immortal. But when my work for Christ is done, I go to be with Jesus. What a wonderful quote that is. If you know the story, Paul eventually arrives in Jerusalem. And as predicted, things don't go well. Even within the church, there was controversy over what some perceived he had been teaching. Then some of the Jews in Jerusalem began to accuse Paul of blasphemy. Riot breaks out and a mob intends to kill Paul. He's only saved by the intervention of the commander of the local Roman regiment, who immediately has Paul arrested, orders him to be flogged. He's out of the frying pan and he's now into the fire type of the thing. I wonder at that point if Paul was reconsidering Agabus's warning. And it's here that Paul really plays his trump card. Let's pick up the story in Acts 22, verse 25, when they tied Paul down and they were about to lash him. And Paul said to the commanding officer, he said there, "Is it legal for you to whip a Roman citizen who hasn't even been tried?" But the Romans don't know what to do with Paul, and while he's still in prison, he gets an unexpected visitor in Acts 23:11. The following night, the Lord stood near Paul, and he said, "Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." Over the next several chapters, as we continue on, we see Paul moved up the chain of command within the Roman authorities there, until finally he ends up in the city of Caesarea in front of the Roman governor, a man by the name of Festus. Governor's trying to, is attempting to sort of placate the Jews. He tells Paul he's going to send him back to Jerusalem, have him stand trial before for the charges that the Jews had brought against him. And Paul responds by saying in Acts 25:10-11, so we're getting far ahead now, "No, this is an official Roman court, so I ought to be tried right here. You know very well I'm not guilty of harming the Jews. If I have done something worthy of death, I don't refuse to die, but if I'm innocent, no one has a right to turn me over to these men, to kill me. I appeal to Caesar." Festus just wants Paul out of his hair, and the story continues in Acts 25:12. Festus conferred with his advisors, and then he replied, "Very well, you have appealed to Caesar, and to Caesar you will go." And you know where Caesar was, right? In Rome. And it wasn't an easy trip to Rome. There were storms, there were shipwrecks, and we finally read the last chapter of Acts. And we read in Acts 28:11-14. "After 3 months we put out to sea in a ship that had wintered in the island. It was an Alexandrian ship with a figurehead of the twin gods Castor and Pollux. We put in at Syracuse and stayed there 3 days. From there we set sail and arrived in Riga. The next day the south wind came up, and on the following day we reached Puteoli. There we found some brothers and sisters who invited us to spend a week with them, and so we came to Rome." That was a long sort of roundabout way to answer the question that we had right at the beginning. The Spirit warned Paul, because it was the only thing that Paul would know what he was getting into. Agabus warned Paul, because that's what prophets do. They warn people about the consequences of their actions. Even if those actions are right, there can be consequences. So Paul continues on to his journey to Jerusalem, because he was convinced that he was right in the centre of God's will, regardless of any circumstance that he found himself in. There may be times when we just have to keep the faith, believe in the mission, regardless of the circumstances that we find ourselves in there. I want to encourage you to just keep the faith, keep on believing, whatever the circumstance may be. Just know that if God is in it, then who's going to be against you? So bless you until we meet again. See you next time.